In this video, we're going to take an introductory look at energy politics and policy. And this is a high-stakes question. It's a high-stakes issue because power generation, electricity generation, is incredibly important for any economy to run. And how do you meet the needs of all those consumers? Well, generally, what happens is you have a buyer, a consumer that wants something. In this case, let's say they want electricity. They want to power their business or power their household. Then you've got sellers. These people might generate electricity. And it's generally kind of complex to get these two people together, but there's a sweet spot where supply meets demand and the market clears and everybody's happy. That's the way a lot of markets work. Market for iPhones, for vehicles, for oranges. But for power generation, it's not that simple because some of the information is a lot more complex. Some of the production is very complex. And then the transmission, how to get the products to the consumer. So these are very complex issues. And as such, the government often gets involved. Remember, in a market, you've got buyers and sellers. Pure market, that's all you need. eBay is an example of a pure market. People want to sell something, they'll get together with a buyer. And eBay is a platform that reduces transaction costs and allows the buyers and sellers to interact. That's how a market works. What other types of arrangements are there? Well, I enjoy watching sports on the weekend, and sometimes when I watch sports, I want to go to the liquor store and to buy some beverages to consume. Well, there's only one place that I can get liquor, and that is our LCBO, our Liquor Control Board of Ontario. It's the only place I can get that in the province. There's no competition. I can't go to different stores. I can't go to a gas station. We call that arrangement a monopoly. The LCBO has a monopoly on liquor sales in the province of Ontario. Now, what do I mean by a monopoly? Well, the characteristics of a monopoly are as follows. A single supplier of a good or service. So in a market like eBay or any type of market you can imagine, there are lots of different suppliers and lots of different buyers, and that's where competition comes from. That's where we get different prices, and the market will clear. The buyers that are willing to pay a price will meet up with the seller, and then eBay will make that transaction happen. Not in a monopoly. There's only one supplier. There's only one place that you can go for that good or service. And for me, that only place I can get my scotch that I want to drink is at the LCBO. Monopolies also have barriers to entry. New firms cannot start up. Walmart cannot say, we are going to start selling scotch tomorrow. There are government regulations that say no. So this monopoly happens to be protected by the government. And most monopolies do have some kind of barrier, whether it's a legal barrier that's enforced by the government or whether it's a practical barrier that exists because of their size or by technology. Monopolies also have an absence of competition or very few substitutes. The LCBO, there's not many other things I could do. I could go to the beer store, which is also a monopoly. I could go to a wine rack or something. So there's still not a lot of good substitutes. There's no other place I can get scotch, aside from maybe driving to Michigan. So what are these effects of a monopoly? When you've got a single supplier that has barriers to entry so no other suppliers can get in the business and there's really no competition for them, they can do whatever they want. And that may mean high prices for the consumer. It could also mean inferior products because nobody's holding them to account. There's no competition that I could go to. The LCBO might give me horrible service and high prices. I can't take my business elsewhere. They're the only place I can go. That also gives them little incentive to innovate. They don't have to think of new ideas and new products for me because they've got my business. There's nowhere else I can go. Can you think of any monopolies like this? There's lots around. Give me one example. Train travel via rail. Now, what would rail competition look like? Might be tough. Might be tough to run train tracks all over the country because there's only so much land. There's train stations, and the train stations are all around urban areas. And so you'd have, if VIA had a lot of competition, there might be several different sets of train tracks around the country. And things would get complicated. There'd be traffic tie-ups. So what happens is the government steps in and says, you know what, in this case, competition, a market system would be too complicated. So we're going to give one company a monopoly. It is a natural monopoly. And why would you do that? Well, basically in a natural monopoly, an industry with one firm is better than an industry with multiple firms. Multi-firm production would be more costly than production by a monopoly. It would be worse. It would be much more costly for 5 different rail companies to run train tracks all over the place. That would be wasteful duplication. That's where the term natural monopoly comes from. It would be much more efficient for one firm to produce the good or service. This also applies, back to the initial point, power generation. You can imagine different firms competing to deliver electricity to your home or to your business would be pretty cumbersome. There would be power lines running all over the place. So if you had 5 different companies competing for your business, would that mean that you would have 5 different sets of power lines running all over your neighborhood? There'd be a lot of wasteful duplication there. Not everybody would be successful, and there'd be the drain on resources ultimately. So what the government does, often in the case of electricity generation, is offer a natural monopoly. We'll say provide licenses to local power authorities to be the one distributor of electricity in a given region. Now there might be multiple different providers because there's different ways of generating electricity, especially here in Canada. There's nuclear power, there's hydroelectric power, we've got coal-fired power, which is almost on the outs in Canada, a big shift to natural gas, and wind power as well. So there's lots of different ways that we could get this power. How do we do this in Canada? Just talk about sources for a minute. Most of our electricity in Canada comes from hydroelectric projects. Much of that in Quebec. Nuclear, 15% nuclear, and then conventional thermal, which lumps together coal and natural gas. And these stats are a few years old, 2010. The big change is that conventional thermal is shrunk a little bit. Now, here's the provincial breakdown. You can see Ontario, really reliant on nuclear. Quebec, BC, Newfoundland, Manitoba, almost exclusively hydroelectric power. Here's Ontario's breakdown by fuel type. 60% of our baseload generation comes from nuclear. We need a lot of electricity to run the province, and you need something reliable, and nuclear is there all the time. Same with hydro. Hydro's pretty reliable. Gas can help cover some of that peak demand when the nuclear and the hydro aren't covering it. You can turn on a couple natural gas plants to pick up the slack. Wind is getting up there, and we're starting to see solar make a bit of an appearance as well, with these numbers being from 2016. United States, a little different picture. One thing that jumps right out at you is coal. 30% of electricity generation as of 2016 in the United States is coming from coal power. A lot of it natural gas, and then a mix of other sources as well. So how do you decide what type of power to generate? Well, this will be a government decision, largely. The government might set targets, for example. It might set a target level of generation, and then it'll ask for proposals. Say, I need this much electricity. Who out there, are there any companies, General Electric, White Westinghouse, anybody build a power plant that can meet this? And the firms might submit their proposals. Some might offer to build a natural gas plant. Some might offer to build a nuclear plant. And then the winning bids are awarded the contract. The government will give the contract to that provider. They might essentially become a natural monopoly for that region. Manitoba is an example of a province that did this. Manitoba Hydro was looking to set a target, and they just didn't want a target of overall kilowatts. They wanted wind power. So what they did, this was way back in 2004, they sent out a request for proposals. They wanted 1,000 megawatts of wind power over the next 10 years. And they had 17 developers. They submitted 84 different proposals. Eventually they narrowed it down and picked 7 developers in 10 locations, and these take multiple years to come online. They take decades by the time these things are actually in operation. But that's an example of how it might work. Government might set a target of how much power they want or what type of electricity they want generated, and then different companies will bid for it. Governments can also subsidize. They can offer subsidies to different companies out there, which are direct payments to producers. Governments can also offer production tax credits, so that means tax credits for producing certain types of electricity. like wind or solar. Feed-in tariffs was the FIT program was here in Ontario as well. That what we'll do is if you're a resident, pardon me, if you're a resident and you install solar panels on your house, you will get credit for the electricity that you feed into the grid, and that's called a feed-in tariff. And that was a successful program for a while. Or they might offer to make guaranteed payments to a producer for given quantities of electricity at a specific price. And they did this with Samsung, for example, and other companies with wind power. They offered to pay them a fixed price, and that didn't really work out that well for the province. So yeah, Ontario's been an example of all of these programs, the feed-in tariff program, direct payments to producers, and different subsidies. So government is heavily involved in power generation and distribution in Ontario. So all the way back around to the initial point, what about markets? Why aren't we using markets to do this? When it comes to electricity generation, we seem to see governments get involved, and what they will often opt for is a highly regulated natural monopoly. What we'll turn to next is markets. Is there any role for markets to play in this system?